In this final video in the series, I'll go over what I've personally done with my own dogs, any regrets I have, and how my general recommendations go in the clinic. Personally, I'm partial to female dogs, and while I love Boomer, he likely will be the one and only male I own. When I got him, I had zero intent of breeding him and anticipated I would neuter him in that 18 to 24 month ballpark. When we got to that point with him, he was the least male dog I had ever been around, and I saw no need to neuter him, so I didn't. At the time, my older girls were older and spayed, which we will discuss shortly, and I just had no reason to neuter him. Fast forward 5 years later, and he was starting to show a few signs I didn't like. Mainly, he was grouchy in certain situations. This wasn't being aggressive or biting, it was just a change. Say you asked him to get out of a chair or disturbed him while sleeping at the end of the bed, he'd grumble about the inconvenience. He was also actively marking much more than he ever had, and although it was contained to the outside, thankfully, but another noticeable change. We neutered him, and none of the issues progressed or became problematic, and the marking quit. With the benefit of hindsight, though, I'm not convinced the issues didn't improve simply because of timing and behaviors. The issues cropped up in 2020, and he was neutered in early 2021. There were a lot of things going on at that time causing a lot of behavior issues, not just in our dogs. I often wonder if given time and more direct attention, if they would have also resolved without neutering. His athletic and hunting performance didn't change at all. It also worked out in the end, as shortly after that we added V, an intact female, to the mix, and there was no way I would have an intact male and female in the same house. Not because I couldn't keep them separate, but because every client that I've had with that combination bemoans the issues with their males during the female's heat cycles. All things being equal, and had I not added a female, I likely would have left him intact, with the benefit of hindsight. My recommendation with male hunting dogs is to wait until at least skeletal maturity, and I err on the side of making sure they get there. So for most dogs, it's in that 18 to 24 month range, if an owner can wait that long. I know the guidelines we discussed talked about waiting until 6 and 12 months with certain breeds, but the key here is that they say no sooner or at least until those times. There is nothing in those guidelines suggesting those are the optimum times. There certainly is no harm in waiting even longer. And so my recommendation for these performance dogs is there is no reason to cut our timeframes too close. Now, with that being said, there are also real world examples of people wanting to or needing to neuter sooner than the 18 to 24 month range. In those cases, I try to make it at least to see if we can get to a year of age. Females are a bit trickier in my opinion, and if you have ever had an in-heat female in your house, you'll understand why. It's a pain in the butt. They typically discharge for around 27 days. I always have managed my dogs with heat pants, which are basically like a Velcro-on short that has a hole for the tail. We would place a sanitary pad in them and change those out several times a day. I always recommend having 2 or even 3 pairs because inevitably you will go to let a dog out, forget they had the pants on until right about the time they squat to urinate and fill them with pee. With my own dogs, early in my life, I thought I would like to have a litter. I was doing a lot of reproductive work and I thought it would be good to experience whelping my own litter. Life had other plans and timing never really worked out. And truth be told, I just don't think I'm cut out for it. I would have been a nervous wreck about my own bitch and then likely got overly attached to a couple of the puppies. All of my females have been kept intact until later in life. My first dog, Emma, did end up going through a pyometra, and as I've mentioned in the series, Belle had multiple malignant mammary tumors. All of the spays usually have surrounded some type of health issue like that. Emma was obviously spayed at the pyo. Maggie, interestingly, had a grade 3 mast cell tumor early in life prior to being spayed, and she ended up being spayed during a mammary tumor removal. That tumor was benign. Lily and V also had benign mammary tumors that precipitated their spays as well. I think with all of them, the youngest any of them were spayed was probably about 5. The dogs I've lost over the years have not been due to any of the issues we have covered, with Belle being the longest lived at 16 and a half, Lily and Maggie both made it to 14, and Emma I lost at 10 to degenerative myelopathy, which is the dog equivalent of Lou Gehrig's disease. Maggie also developed urinary incontinence after her spay, which was later in life. Of these dogs, my greatest regret is probably not having a puppy out of Lily. Belle is a close second on that regret list, although Boomer is out of the same lines. But as I mentioned, I'm just not cut out to be a dog breeder, and I'm eternally grateful for the good ones. For client dogs, I've always been a little reserved because for most of my career, we didn't have the science that we do now. If a dog had any sort of health or conformational issues, I would strongly recommend letting a bitch go through at least one heat cycle prior to the spay, which most dogs would get us out to that year ballpark. From the guidelines we've discussed in this series, my standard recommendation now for females will be essentially in line with males. Definitely get them to skeletal maturity, shooting for over 1 year of age. And with golden retrievers, I'd look at leaving them intact or performing an ovary sparing spay. I do need to give one caveat here. The older a dog gets, and if there is any extra fat, the spay becomes a very, much more difficult procedure than it is in a young dog. Truth be told, I'd do just about any emergency intra-abdominal surgery in the world over a fully mature fat dog spay. It is also probably one of the most undervalued and undercharged procedures a vet performs, as spays and neuters are typically underpriced compared to other surgeries so that owners get them done. See the first video in this series as to why. The reason I bring that up is that if the profession is suddenly doing a lot more old dog spays, there may be a change in the pricing of that procedure. And as someone who hasn't done a spay in probably about 10 years, I will tell you that increase will be justified. An old dog neuter is a bit more involved than a young dog neuter, but still a relatively straightforward procedure in comparison. I think if there is one take home from this series, it is that you can do right by your dog with spaying, neutering, or keeping intact. The important thing is that you want to avoid following blanket recommendations as you are making that decision. Find a veterinarian that is willing to have an open-minded conversation and is willing to do what is right for your situation and for your dog.